Well, good afternoon. I'm not a professor, so I don't have these slides, and I didn't go to the Drucker School. But I am a lawyer, so I can talk a long time. So you can take off your shoes, loosen your belt, and get ready for what will be, I hope, an interesting ride. I was looking at the program for today, and it talked about the Drucker Day leadership arc. And what it reminded me of is, a statement we probably all heard. I think Martin Luther King made it famous when he said, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I want to share with you a little bit about my experience, because I really believe that to be true, about how I've seen the moral arc of the universe. And then what I think I've learned about change, and what I think all of us who work for companies and institutions, some of the lessons that I've learned about what I think we can do and what we should do to try and make that moral arc move a little faster and not be as long, and let's see if we can't get justice in our society sooner rather than later. I think all of us are usually informed by our own personal experiences. And that can lead to a lot of misperceptions, a lot of anecdotal evidence. We try and generalize that specific instance that happened to us to happening to everybody. But my life started, and I like to say that when I was born into the American caste system as an untouchable. When I was born, it was still routine for black men to be lynched. When I was born, most of the people that were black in America couldn't vote. When I was born, there was no black caucus because there were no black people in Congress. When I was born, we did not have black folks on TV or in the movies or part of the mainstream of American life. And if you looked at movies and things from the time when I was born, we were absent. When I started college, most black people in America still couldn't vote. It still was illegal for black and white couples to marry. We had laws against miscegenation. We had laws that ensured that investments in real estate would only be for the white middle class and not for the black. The FHA would not loan money in integrated neighborhoods. So as World War II ended and people took advantage of the GI Bill and FHA and all the largesse of the American government, they put black folks in housing projects like Cabrini Green, as opposed to giving mortgages so you could buy your home. When I started college, most black folks in America were still going to segregated schools. I grew up in a poor family. Neither of my parents had the opportunity to finish elementary school. They were sharecroppers in Texas. They came to California as migrant farm workers. We ended up settling in Ventura County because they would spend part of the year picking cotton in the San Joaquin Valley. And what a lot of people don't know about the history of our state is before we had a lot of Latino farm workers and Bracero farm workers, we had Chinese labor and we had black labor. If you go to the Central Valley, all the little towns, Wasco, Shafter, Pixley, Delano, Weed Patch, all up and down the San Joaquin Valley, full of black folks who were recruited from the South to come and pick cotton in California. When World War II started, that was the first time that they allowed black men to join the construction union. My father got a job as a laborer, and so literally he was picking lemons with my mother in Ventura County when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December 1941. And there was a labor shortage. My father got a job as a hod carrier, working construction labor. I grew up in Ventura. Ventura had a black population that was less than 1% of the population. I went to UCLA as an undergrad, and when I got to UCLA, there were 29,500 students on campus. There were 80 black Americans. Then I decided I was going to be like Ralph Bunche. I wanted to be a Foreign Service officer. I got involved in a program that the Ford Foundation had started because when I was in college, this is like 1966, there were no black Foreign Service officers. Ralph Bunche had been a black Foreign Service officer. He had won the Nobel Peace Prize. He was an icon at UCLA, so I said, I want to be like Ralph Bunche. So I got top secret security clearance. I went to work for the Voice of America in the summer of 1967. And for me, it was an awakening of what America was really like. It was the first time I'd ever been around a lot of black folks. And I used to walk the streets of Washington, D.C., and just marvel at what it was like. I worked for the Vietnamese branch of The Voice. And for those of you who are history buffs, in 1967, that was one of the years we had a massive troop buildup in Vietnam. But more importantly, from my perspective, it was the beginning of the black conscious movement as we had an end sort of the civil rights movement that we all know. In the summer of 1967, there were 107 race riots in America. Or riots in Newark, Detroit, all over the country. And it made me change my ambition from becoming a Foreign Service officer. I said, how can I go represent the pig power structure when black folks are being killed all over America? I decided I was going to become a civil rights lawyer. So I ended up going to law school. And when I got out of law school, I started looking around for a job with civil rights organizations. What I found is most civil rights organizations can't afford lawyers. They work from hand to mouth like so many nonprofit organizations, and what they rely upon is they rely upon volunteer attorneys. Most of the volunteer attorneys are lawyers who work for major law firms that are able to volunteer on a pro bono basis in order to get involved in handling litigation. So I went to work for a major law firm in Los Angeles that had a long history of allowing its associates to become involved in pro bono activities. And I became a trial lawyer. I was a litigator. And I did cases for the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights. I did things with the ACLU. I eventually left that firm after about 5 years and started my own firm because I wanted to do more pro bono work. I wanted to do more civil rights work. And I started to represent the NAACP in the Los Angeles school desegregation case, Crawford versus Board of Education. And it was in many respects an eye-opener for me because I grew up in Ventura, which was a small town with a great public education system. We didn't have a lot of minority students. We had 10 black kids in my graduating class of about 550. Of those 10, 8 went to college, 2 went to the military. And there was nothing special about that group of kids. It just happened to be the school system that they went to. Started doing work in the school desegregation case in Los Angeles, and I realized that the education that was being given to the majority of minority kids in that system was less than deficient. There were high schools in which they offered no courses that would get you into a college or university. There were high schools in which there would be no kids who went to college. So I found my passion. And it sort of coincides with what those who studied Peter Drucker know. It was obvious then, and it's more obvious now, that we're living in a world in which you cannot be successful unless you are well educated. Because the honest day's work, as Peter Drucker used to say, which used to be done with your hands, the calluses of your hand, the sweat of your brow, the strength of your back. The work we do today depends on the knowledge that you possess in your mind and in your brain. And if you do not provide an adequate education to young people, then you know that you have handicapped them and their families for the rest of their lives. I know this to be true because I grew up, as I said, in a poor family. And when I was in law school, I worked in I had a lot of jobs. One of the jobs I had, I worked in the financial aid office. And I know that I happened to be the poorest guy that was in the law school because they would rank us for work study. And I always was number one in ranking because I could make the most money because my family and I had the least money. But my going to college and my going to law school changed the outcomes for everybody in my family. My mother, my father, my brothers, I was the oldest. I went to college. Once I figured out how to get there, all of my brothers went to college. Because I had an education, I was able to help manage the health care of my parents, my grandparents, my relatives. Because I went to college, it was a foregone conclusion that my children would go to college. So all of a sudden, I felt like somebody who had stood on one side of a fence. I was able to climb the fence. The side of the fence that I was on was a side in which there was not a lot of fruit and vegetables. It was a desert. And when I got to the other side, it was an oasis. If we're going to be a competitive country in the 21st century, we've got to lower that wall and make sure that all of our youth are able to climb that fence and participate in the oasis that exists on the other side. So what I learned was when I started trying to say, okay, let me try and figure out how can I begin to fix our education system as one individual. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is that revolutions aren't started by the masses. Revolutions are started by the few. A few people that have a made-up mind and that are committed to change can make that change happen because people identify with success. I started creating social organizations when I was at UCLA. When I was at UCLA, as I said, we had very few black students. We had one black professor that was in the engineering department. And so one of the things that I said is we got to have more black professors, we got to have more Asian professors, we've got to have more professors of color at the academy because the academy is a collection of scholars. They decide what they teach, they decide what they research, they decide how that's disseminated and to who it's disseminated. So I'm a student, and students come and go, the faculty stays. So one of the things that I worked on, and I like to say I was successful getting done, is I created the African American Studies program. I wrote a proposal, became friends with Chuck Young, who was the chancellor. He agreed. It made a lot of sense for us to have a Black Studies program at UCLA. We created a Black Studies program. That program became, for me and for the students that I work with, it became the wedge that created a demand for black professors, for Asian professors, for Chicano professors to come to the academy so that they would then be there to continue to change the university in a way that would make it welcoming, acceptable, and a place where minority students could come and achieve and find someone to mentor them. That became a model that I've tried to use throughout my life. So as I started to work on how do we do other change with public education, I really got involved in the nonprofit sector. The nonprofit sector for me, and for people, I think, like me, who think about social change, it really is the vehicle that you can use to do venture capital on social change. The reason simply is that most of the things that we want to change, especially with education and some of our social systems, it's government funded, huge bureaucracies, a lot of vested interest in the status quo, and it's very hard to get them to change what they do. And so it takes somebody who has money that can afford to try something that may or may not work, and if it fails, nobody says you wasted taxpayer money because it's private philanthropy. For those of you who are in business school, and as I said, I'm not an academic, but we had this conversation at lunch. I had this conversation with Cynthia. Most successful businesses fail because they're successful. I have a friend who's a professor, and he says, if you look at economic history, there are very few businesses that have lasted for more than 100 years. He always has two examples, Kirin Beer, which has existed more or less continuously for more than 800 years, and the Catholic Church, which has existed for thousands. But most businesses fail because the success that you create makes you begin to believe you've got the answer. And because you have the answer, you're never willing to throw out all that you do. You're not going to get rid of all your warehouses, all your employees, all the culture you've created, which created your success, to go do something new. So the classic examples that we have in the modern era would be somebody like IBM. Great organization, had a whole monopoly on creating mainframes and computers and stuff. Never believed that the personal computer had any value. So therefore, there was no need to really develop software. So they gave it to Bill Gates. Said, kid, you want to do something with software, go ahead, but there's no market for the home computer. Well, guess what? IBM doesn't make computers. Microsoft became one of the biggest companies in the world. Same thing happened with Google. Sergey Brin, Larry Page, they go to Microsoft and they said, we have a great idea for organizing information on the internet. We think that people ought to be able to search and find things faster. Engineers at Microsoft said, great idea, kid, but there's no business there, we're not interested. Google's now bigger than Microsoft. And we can go on and on. Whatever happened to Polaroid? One of the high-tech companies that had, patents and had created many of the things that led to the digital revolution of today, and yet where is Polaroid today? So the same thing is true in the social sector. You have a school system, you have a business, it works very well. How do you go and get them to say, what you're doing makes no sense. You're not educating lots of kids. You need to change the way in which you deliver education to these kids if you want to be successful. You're simply not going to change. And I probably spent, 25, 30 years working with Los Angeles Unified School District on trying to get it to change the way in which it delivered education to the kids in our community. Couldn't get them to change. I once was chairman of an organization called Los Angeles Annenberg Metropolitan Project. Walter Annenberg gave us $50 million challenge grant to work on school reform in Los Angeles. We raised and spent $120 million trying to change education, the way it was being delivered and the way it was being done. I think we moved the needle nary a point. Finally, I hired a group of consultants. I hired WestEd, and I said, I want you to assume we had no education system. We had no school board. We had brand new group of people. We're here like de novo. Tell me how we could create a school system that could educate the high levels, poor kids, immigrant kids, English language learners, special ed kids. Design that system. I don't care what it costs. And then once you design it, I want you to go back and then put on it the constraints that we have in our system: money, facilities, personnel. And tell me, what could we do that would reasonably make a difference in the education of kids? Well, they came back and they said, take advantage of the charter school legislation. And so I was involved with starting an organization we have in Los Angeles. It's called the Alliance for College-Ready Public Schools. We started 12 years ago with one school. Our idea was to try and demonstrate what was possible. So we created a school in the lowest performing area of LA. And we were told that the most difficult students to educate are high school students. So we said, okay, we'll start a high school. And in this poor area off of Martin Luther King Boulevard. Today, 12 years later, we have 28 schools. We have almost 13,000 students. All of our schools are located in the lowest performing areas, the worst area, the quote unquote worst areas where there are gangs and things in LA. The students who come to our schools usually are 4 to 5 grade levels behind. And all of our kids who stay with us 4 years graduate from high school. 95% of them get accepted to college. And this is in a neighborhood where the surrounding high school may have 2 kids who go to college. And they may have a high school graduation rate of 50%. Now, there's nothing we're doing differently because we have the same education standards that everybody has. There's state standards you have to meet, but we manage it differently. All of the conversation you've heard here today has talked about the importance of the way in which you treat your employees, the importance of finding leaders who understand how to lead and can make a difference. So in the schools that we have a longer school day, we have a longer school year, we have a committed faculty. My daughter was one of the faculty members who taught at one of our schools for a number of years. We ask our teachers to take the position that it's your responsibility to educate, and there are no excuses that are allowed to say, well, these are poor kids. Their folks don't speak English. They come from a gang-infested area. They come to school hungry. They have all these deficiencies. How can we educate them? The answer is we have to figure out how to educate them because that's our job, because we're preparing people for the 21st century. What we need to do is we need to change all of our educational systems for the reality that if America is going to be strong, if it's going to be powerful, if it's going to be influential, we must educate our young. For all of you in the audience who are like my vintage or who are more than 50, I always say, go down to your local high school and see if you can find 2 kids that you can guarantee they're going to graduate, they're going to go to college, they're going to earn enough money so that they can pay taxes to support a government, a defense, their children, to repair the streets and the roads and the bridges in our society. And if you can't find 2, then that tells you right now there's nobody going to be there for your retirement, and there's nobody that's going to be there to maintain our economy, our culture, and our democracy. So in my view, there is no more pressing issue in our society today than the education of our young. If we educate our kids, we won't have healthcare problems. We won't have income inequality. We won't have prisons full of people. If you go to prisons, what you're going to find is over 90% of the people in prison did not graduate from high school. In California, if you are a black boy, if you're a brown boy, and you don't graduate from high school, you have a 90% chance of going to prison. It's prison, the pipeline that's created by the failure of the education system. If you graduate from high school, the chances that you're going to go to prison are about 13%. So we had to do a lot of analytics. The analytics tell us that if we don't educate our kids, they're going to jail. And when they go to jail, it's going to cost us about $60,000 a year to keep them there. If they go to college, they become productive citizens, and they pay taxes, we have a better country, a better community, a better civilization. So I've learned the power of the nonprofit sector to be able to do things to focus change. So what I'm now trying to do with my life is I'm trying to figure out how do I get more people engaged in the conversation with philanthropy so that we can begin to change our society and make that arc that bends towards justice bend a little faster and get there a little sooner. So many of our nonprofit organizations are self-perpetuating organizations. Those of you who've been on boards, you know the way that you pick a board is the board picks the board members. And for so long, what we've done is we've always done the same thing. And I don't know, was it Einstein who said the definition of being insane is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result? We live in a society that is the most multicultural, multi-ethnic society on the face of the earth. Our difference is our strength. And yet, in vast sectors of our economy, we're not taking advantage of that difference. So one of the things that I try and do is I work with leaders, when I talk with groups like this, I really try and become sort of the Johnny Appleseed who's trying to plant the seeds that it's necessary, it's important, and in fact, I think it's an imperative for us to begin to make sure that we have diverse governing boards at all levels for all the things that we do. In the last recession that we had, the 2008-2009 recession, McKinsey and Company did a white paper. I think they issued it in 2011. And what they tried to do is they tried to figure out which companies performed the best during that recession and what was it that helped them to achieve the success they achieved in very difficult financial circumstances. And they said overwhelmingly what they found is that those companies, they had the most diverse boards, and I meant diversity along a number of different dimensions, ethnicity, gender, race. They performed significantly better than those that were not diverse. And you know, we all know that that's true. If you think back to the nursery rhymes that a lot of us learned when we were young, remember the story about the emperor who had no clothes? Remember there was this con man who came and said he's going to spin gold with these great garments, and he got all this gold, and he kept spinning, and they kept saying, don't you see how beautiful the garments are? And nobody wanted to admit that they couldn't see that there was no garment there. Everybody agreed that, yeah, it's a beautiful garment. And when the king finally put it on and went on a parade, it took a little boy to say, the emperor has no clothes on. That's what happens when you have diversity. You have diversity, what you get is a different perspective on the world. You see the world differently because you bring your life experiences, you bring what you have learned, what you have seen to problem solving. And unless in a society like we have, unless we are committed to ensuring that we include all voices all the time, it will be very difficult for us to have the success that we want to have, whether it's in a business or a nonprofit organization. So my message to you today is a simple one. Let's try and have this moral arc that's bending towards justice, that is long and slow. Let's all commit ourselves to trying to accelerate its growth, accelerate its development. Let us be committed to inviting others that don't look like us, that don't live where we live, to participate in making decisions so that we can try and help make this great country that we all love and that we all participate in be the kind of society that we would like for it to be. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.